final project, Community-Based Education Initiative, represented by Iman Naika for the course about Aboriginal Teaching and Learning, instructor Roxanne Letter Log, date December 1, 2024. Land acknowledgement. First, I want to start my journey of learning in this course by acknowledging and thanking the land on which I work and live, as well as the people who have cared for it. I live on the traditional land of Stolo. Introduction. This presentation gives a quick history of the Aboriginal people, identifies the main housing-related problems that Indigenous communities in BC face, and suggests solutions. It is intended for the Aboriginal Housing Management Association based on my discussion with Mrs. Shayla Miracle, a respected member of the Mohawk Nation member, and on my extensive research. Indigenous people in BC. Since time immemorial, that is before recollection or record, First Nations people have resided in British Columbia. When Europeans came to conquer British Columbia in the middle of the 18th century, there were tens of thousands of First Nations people living here. Background summary about Indigenous people in BC. The world's largest and most diverse gathering of Indigenous people is found in British Columbia. This opens up a world of interesting stories and experiences, though they all have unique cultures that originated in their respective regions. Many First Nations share language families that were established over thousands of years for social and commercial purposes. In Canada, there are over 600 different Indigenous communities and about 1.6 million Indigenous people. British Columbia is home to little over 200 of these communities. Approximately 80% of British Columbia's Indigenous population resides in towns and cities outside of their traditional areas. Based on the British Columbia Province 2021 Census of Population Focus on Geography series, 62.1% of British Columbia's Indigenous population were First Nations, 33.7% were Métis, and 0.6% were Inuit. Developing understanding through dialogue, speaking with an Aboriginal member. To gain a deeper understanding of the challenges faced by Aboriginal people and explore potential solutions, I decided to have a conversation with an Aboriginal member. I reached out to the Indigenous Department in the Surrey District to arrange a meeting. This experience provided a meaningful opportunity to observe Indigenous protocols, including engaging in a face-to-face discussion, sharing a meal, and offering a small gift as a gesture of appreciation. Mrs. Shayla Miracle and I met on Monday, November 18 at 6 p.m. at Tim Hortons in Surrey, British Columbia. Challenges faced by Indigenous people in British Columbia. The challenges that Indigenous communities in British Columbia face are quite similar to those that Indigenous communities in other Canadian provinces encounter. In our meeting, we discussed several of important topics such as water quality. The tap water in many Indigenous communities in Canada is hazardous to drink due to boiled water advisories. The obvious contrast between Indigenous reserves and cities like Winnipeg was exemplified by one such instance. While closed reserves frequently have contaminated water sources, like the Winnipeg River, urban areas may have access to safe drinking water. Constant racism. For Indigenous peoples, systemic racism continues to be a major obstacle that limits their access to opportunities, resources, and fair treatment. Housing crisis in BC. We focus on housing, which is a major problem facing BC's Indigenous population. For Indigenous communities, access to safe, reasonably priced, and culturally suitable housing remains a crucial problem, made worse by past injustices and contemporary socio-economic issues. Unaffordability. The expense of housing is a big challenge because rental prices in many areas are far higher than a month's salary. Many people feel obligated to work numerous jobs for this reason, particularly if they have children to support. The low shelter rates for those receiving income or disability assistance require them to live in shared housing, which puts them at risk of homelessness if they don't have someone with whom to split expenses. Mrs. Miracle's perspective. Many Aboriginal families are currently being pushed out of the housing market to afford what's on the market. Two parents must earn between $175,000 and $200,000 annually. As a result, large number of indigenous people have been forced to relocate to neighboring provinces, leave urban districts, or move away from cities. Housing quality. In the British Columbia, large number of indigenous households live in inadequate housing, which causes serious risks to their health and safety. These homes frequently have structural flaws, including old plumbing, leaky roofs, and insufficient insulation. 18% of indigenous households living in urban, rural, and northern areas are experiencing core housing needs, meaning their housing falls below at least one of the adequacy, affordability, or suitability standards, as mentioned in the Indigenous Corporate Training. Discrimination. Part 1. When looking for a place to live in Toronto, one of Canada's most difficult property markets, Richard Peters, an Indigenous man from Beausoleil First Nation, encountered unexpected challenges. He and his fiancée, Janine Castor, moved from Ottawa in July 2014, and for a year they lived with friends. Discrimination. Part 2. Discrimination was discovered throughout the 4 month long process of finding their own place. Peters observed that, probably as a result of his Anglophone name, landlords answered his rental inquiries promptly. However, landlords would frequently request additional paperwork and information after seeing him in person and realizing he was First Nations, creating additional obstacles in the process. This demonstrates the discrimination that Indigenous people usually face in the housing market. Mrs. Miracle's perspective. Additionally, Mrs. Miracle shared her thoughts on the racism that Indigenous people encounter in the housing market. In order to avoid discrimination, she recalled hearing stories of people being pressured to change their last names on rental applications. Landlords might not want to rent to you if your name sounds Indigenous, like Little Mustache or Star Blanket, she clarified. They spread the myth that Aboriginal people overcrowd their homes, damage properties, and are constantly late with rent. These damaging prejudices make it even more difficult for Indigenous people to get housing by sustaining systemic discrimination. Overcrowded housing. According to the National Occupancy Standard, more than 1 in 6 Indigenous people, about like 17.1%, resided in housing considered unsuitable for the population residing there. 10% of Indigenous people lived in housing with a one-bedroom deficiency, 3% lived in housing with a two-bedroom shortfall, and 2% lived in housing with a three-bedroom or more shortfall. Initiative Proposal. Indigenous Housing Partnership Program. This project intends to use a cooperative, community-driven strategy to help solve the housing crisis that British Columbia's Indigenous communities are currently facing. With input from Indigenous communities and under the direction of Indigenous values and needs, the Indigenous Housing Partnership Program will focus on developing safe, reasonably priced, and culturally relevant housing options. Promising Practices Part 1. Based on insights from Mrs. Sheila Miracle and extensive research, I have identified the following solutions to address the housing challenges faced by Indigenous communities. Increase the provision of housing. Modify the current housing stock and establish new housing units that are affordable and suitable for Indigenous families. Developing appropriate housing. engage indigenous builders, architects, and leaders to ensure that the plans for the houses are embedded with the traditions and principles. Energy efficient and green solutions. Use energy conserving devices and green building materials to reduce future costs and minimize the degradation of the environment. Promising Practices Part 2: Strengthening capacity and ownership of the community. Mobilize local indigenous communities to participate and take ownership of the housing construction projects by providing training in construction, project management, and maintenance. Financing. Requests for further funding, such as government grants, business sponsorship, and other funding sources to promote the development of the project. Resources. Engage social entrepreneurs and nonprofit for resources such as funding the training programs and construction materials. Having a mentor who understands financial planning and management would make a tremendous difference, said Mrs. Miracle. Real life example: Mrs. Miracle highlighted the innovative real estate development initiative in Squamish Nation. Mrs. Shayla Merkel brought attention to a remarkable new project by the Squamish Nation, which has just purchased or perhaps repurchased a sizable portion of downtown Vancouver real estate. They have already created a business plan to build 5 apartment complexes, she stated. This approach shows how the Aboriginal Housing Management Association can help similar community driven projects, enabling Indigenous nations to develop housing solutions that are both sustainable and culturally relevant. Call for action. The Aboriginal Housing Management Association is warmly invited to work with us to carry out this project and promote housing options for Indigenous communities. Conclusion: To sum up, this project has brought attention to the major challenges that British Columbia's Indigenous people face and some promising practices to solve the housing crisis in BC. It is our collective responsibility as allies and organizations to collaborate and address the challenges faced by Indigenous communities. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and a special thanks to Mrs. Shayla Merkel for her time, insights, and assistance. These are the references. Thank you.